The palace thought this question could stay hidden forever. They thought it could sit quietly behind closed doors, buried beneath royal schedules, state duties, and carefully rehearsed smiles. But then King Charles reportedly made a final decision so unexpected, so far-reaching, that even Princess Anne, the woman famous for never showing emotion, never panicking, never being caught off guard, was allegedly left completely speechless. And when someone like Anne falls silent, people start asking dangerous questions. What exactly did Charles decide? Why was this conversation wrapped in extraordinary secrecy? And why are insiders whispering that this single decision could quietly reshape the monarchy long after Charles is gone? For weeks, strange signals were reportedly emerging from inside Buckingham Palace. Not dramatic scandals, not explosive arguments, something almost more unsettling. Silence, the kind of silence that makes experienced palace staff nervous. Meetings reportedly vanished from schedules without explanation. Conversations supposedly stopped the moment certain individuals entered a room. Doors closed more often, smiles looked tighter, and at the center of it all stood King Charles himself, appearing more reflective than usual, as though he was carrying a burden that nobody else could quite see. What made the situation so intriguing was that it wasn't about a current crisis. It wasn't about a scandal threatening the crown. It wasn't even about Queen Camilla's position today. That battle had already been fought. For decades, Camilla endured criticism, controversy, and endless public scrutiny. Many believed she would never be fully accepted. Yet somehow, through patience and persistence, she eventually stood beside Charles during the coronation as queen. To many observers, that moment felt like the final chapter of an extraordinary royal journey. But according to reports, the real question was never about becoming queen. The real question was what happens afterward. And that question apparently haunted discussions deep inside palace walls. Because while the public focused on present-day royal headlines, senior figures were reportedly thinking years ahead. What happens when William becomes king? What role does Camilla hold then? What title remains? What influence continues? And perhaps most importantly, how does the institution protect itself from confusion during one of the most sensitive transitions in modern royal history? These weren't small questions. They were the kind of questions that can define generations. And apparently Charles had reached the point where avoiding them was no longer an option. According to accounts circulating among royal observers, advisors spent weeks examining every possible outcome: constitutional traditions, historical precedents, public reactions, future implications. Every scenario reportedly carried risks. Every solution created new complications. Yet at the heart of every discussion sat one unavoidable reality. Charles loved Camilla. That reality couldn't be ignored. This was the woman who stood beside him through some of the most difficult chapters of his life. The woman who endured relentless criticism. The woman who remained loyal when public opinion was anything but kind. Whatever anyone thinks about their history, Charles reportedly viewed her sacrifices as deeply personal and impossible to forget. Yet there was another reality sitting beside that one. Charles wasn't simply a husband, he was the king. And kings are often forced to make decisions that hurt personally while serving institutionally. That contradiction reportedly became impossible to escape. Sources suggest that Charles found himself caught between personal loyalty and constitutional responsibility, between protecting someone he loved and preparing the monarchy for a future beyond his own reign. Neither path was comfortable, neither path was easy, but eventually, according to reports, Charles chose one. That's when everything changed. The conversations that had supposedly stretched across months suddenly became focused. Palace discussions became less hypothetical and more decisive. Advisors who were once exploring possibilities reportedly found themselves preparing for implementation. Something had happened. A conclusion had been reached. And then came the meeting with Princess Anne. Now, Anne is not known for emotional reactions. Quite the opposite. Across decades of royal service, she has built a reputation as perhaps the toughest member of the family. She has faced scandals, crises, criticism, and pressure with remarkable composure. She rarely appears rattled. She rarely appears surprised, which is exactly why this meeting became so fascinating. Reports suggest the arrangements surrounding the audience were unusually tight. Security protocols were elevated. Attendance was extremely limited. Individuals who might normally be present reportedly weren't included. Even by palace standards, the secrecy stood out. The message was obvious. Whatever Charles intended to discuss was important, very important. Anne reportedly entered expecting a serious conversation, but what she allegedly encountered was something else entirely. Because Charles wasn't seeking advice. He wasn't asking for opinions. He wasn't testing reactions. The decision had already been made. And according to those familiar with descriptions of the meeting, Charles delivered it with remarkable certainty. Gone was the hesitation. Gone was the careful weighing of options. Gone was the endless consideration of alternatives. Instead, there was conviction. Absolute conviction. As Charles reportedly explained his vision for Camilla's future role, Anne listened and listened and listened. The silence reportedly became noticeable. Not because she disagreed, not because she she approved, but because she was processing the scale of what she was hearing. This wasn't merely about a title. It wasn't merely about ceremonial duties. It wasn't even solely about Camilla. It was about the future structure of the monarchy itself. Every detail Charles outlined reportedly connected to a larger picture, a carefully designed transition that would stretch beyond his reign and directly affect William's eventual kingship. That's the moment many insiders believe left Anne stunned, because suddenly this wasn't a family discussion. It was a blueprint, a roadmap, a declaration of how Charles believed the monarchy should function after him. And once that realization settled in, the weight of the conversation reportedly became impossible to ignore. For someone who had spent her entire life watching monarchs make difficult choices, Anne allegedly recognized exactly what she was witnessing. Not indecision, not uncertainty, not even sentiment. She was witnessing a king who had finally made up his mind. A king choosing what he believed was necessary for the institution's future, regardless of how emotionally complicated that choice might be. And according to those closest to the story, that realization may have been even more shocking than the decision itself. What happened after that meeting may have been even more fascinating than the meeting itself. Because, according to reports, Princess Anne's initial shock didn't remain shock for very long. That's not how Anne operates. She has spent her entire life inside one of the world's most scrutinized institutions. Surprise is temporary. Analysis is permanent. And as the hours reportedly passed, Anne began examining what Charles had actually done and why he had done it. The more she considered the implications, the more she allegedly recognized something familiar. Not because she necessarily agreed with every detail, not because she found the decision comfortable, but because she had spent decades watching another monarch make similar choices. Queen Elizabeth II built her reign on difficult decisions that often required separating personal feelings from institutional responsibilities. Time and again, she placed the crown ahead of individual preferences. Sometimes the public understood those choices immediately. Sometimes they didn't. But history often viewed them differently years later. And according to insiders, Anne reportedly saw echoes of that same thinking in Charles's approach. This wasn't being framed as a punishment for Camilla. It wasn't being framed as a reduction of her importance. It was being framed as something entirely different. Definition, clarity, structure. For years, uncertainty had surrounded questions about Camilla's future position once Charles was no longer on the throne. Palace insiders reportedly treated the subject with extreme caution. Nobody wanted to appear insensitive. Nobody wanted to trigger unnecessary controversy. Nobody wanted to reopen old wounds connected to decades of public debate. So the issue remained suspended in uncertainty, acknowledged but unresolved, discussed but never finalized, until now. Reports suggest Charles has effectively ended that ambiguity by establishing a clear framework for Camilla's future role during William's eventual reign. Rather than allowing confusion to emerge during a period of national transition, the king reportedly chose to settle those questions in advance. And when viewed through that lens, the move begins to look less like a personal decision and more like a strategic one. Think about the pressure surrounding a royal succession. The death or departure of a monarch creates an enormous institutional shift. Titles change, responsibilities move, relationships evolve overnight. Public attention becomes relentless. Every gesture is analyzed. Every decision becomes a headline. The last thing the monarchy needs during such a moment is uncertainty surrounding one of its most visible figures. According to sources, Charles appears determined to remove that uncertainty before it becomes a crisis. And that brings another major figure into the story, Prince William, because every decision made today will ultimately shape the environment in which William inherits the throne. Reports suggest William and Catherine were carefully briefed on the broader implications of these discussions, not merely because they concern Camilla, but because they concern the future architecture of the monarchy itself. A future king benefits from stability. A future king benefits from clarity. A future king benefits when difficult questions have already been answered. That appears to be the logic driving much of this planning. And inside palace corridors, the effects were reportedly felt almost immediately. No public announcement was made, no official statement appeared. Yet observers claim the atmosphere shifted noticeably. The uncertainty of an unresolved debate was replaced by the anticipation of a completed decision waiting for its eventual reveal. People spoke more carefully. Questions multiplied. Answers became scarce. And as always within royal circles, silence became its own form of communication. The fascinating part is that this entire story ultimately circles back to Camilla herself. Few royal figures have experienced a journey quite like hers. Years ago, the idea of her becoming queen seemed almost unimaginable to many observers. Public opposition was fierce. Criticism was constant. Yet through persistence and patience, she gradually secured a place beside Charles at the highest level of royal life. That journey alone would have been extraordinary. But now another chapter is reportedly being written. A chapter focused not on how she became queen, but on how her place in royal history will be defined beyond Charles's reign. And perhaps that's why this story continues generating so much intrigue. Because beneath the the titles, ceremonies, and palace walls sits a far more complicated question. What happens when personal loyalty collides with institutional duty? What happens when a king must think not only about the present, but about decades that will unfold after he's gone? According to reports, Charles believes he has answered that question. Princess Anne may have been stunned by the scale of the decision, but she reportedly recognized the reasoning behind it. The monarchy is preparing for a future transition. Roles are being clarified, expectations are being defined, and whether people ultimately praise or criticize the decision, one thing appears increasingly clear. The future of the royal family is already being shaped behind closed doors. And if the whispers coming from palace insiders are even partially accurate, the consequences of this decision may continue unfolding long after today's headlines disappear. The meeting may be over, the decision may be made, but the story itself feels far from finished.